So the scope of the work, I'll start with that, and we identified a number of trust relationships in an OAuth environment. So we have the resource server and the authorization server and a client, and there is kind of like a mutual relationship between either of these entities, either two of these entities. And so the trust between the client and the resource server is a trust by delegation that is kind of consolidated in that access token. The presumption of OAuth is that the resource server and the client do not need to establish a trust, and they can rely on the authorization server to FHIR that further. The trust between the resource server and the authorization server is actually an interesting area, which we did not focus on this document. I think so far the state of the world is that people usually install authorization servers even in the same organization. So you have a resource server and you have your own OAuth server within an organization or security domain. But it is an interesting possibility where
Mohammed?
Can you hear me?
I can.
Kathleen, what was the question?
I'm the one lost.
Okay.
Yeah, is there anybody else on the call that can hear us?
I can hear you just fine.
Okay. Yeah. So the idea that the relationship and the trust relationship between the resource server and the authorization server in an OAuth environment could be dynamic, and a resource server could dynamically rely on different OAuth servers. It's an interesting idea. I think UMA tried to deal with some of that or going in that direction. But it is not something that is practically the state of the world at the moment. And so we kind of did not focus on that. And there's also less dynamicity in the way that these things are set up. So usually the resource server and authorization server kind of have a static trust set up where they sit down and exchange credentials and they set up the API connections, and that part is not very much dynamic. So that's how we kind of narrowed down the scope of this to the client registration, where a client and an auth server, a client that could be potentially unbeknownst to the authorization server prior to this interaction starts engaging with the authorization server to become a legitimate OAuth client. And that's something that's captured in the OAuth specification as the dynamic client registration. And there's other solutions as I will get to later. So that's where we started. And then there were some high-level requirements that we wanted to address. There was this scalability requirement, where we increasingly deal with applications where there's a large number of clients that need to be signed up, and it's not a scalable or efficient assumption to assume that we can actually manually sign them up by exchanging credentials or entering their names in a database or a spreadsheet or some such trust setup. The other high-level concern requirement is the separation of concerns. Especially when the issue of assessment and evaluation is involved. Evaluating certain attributes in a client is something that is not really the business of the resource server or the organization in charge of the resource server or the OAuth server. And we want to be able to move towards a system where these things can be outsourced, and organizations that are specialized in those areas could do the vouching and assessment, and the ecosystem could rely on third-party endorsers. And then, of course, we consider interoperability as a major requirement. Trust spectrum is something that at a high level, we wanted to make sure that the trust decision is not a binary decision. So our system is able to consider gradual trust in a way that there's different attributes that could be associated with a trust relationship. And depending on where a client resides in that spectrum, different policy decisions are made about that client. And the last high-level requirement that was identified is to be able to make decisions in a rule-based basis. So either minimize the manual or subjective decisions that requires a human judgment, or isolate them into boxes where they don't withhold the entire process, and at least parts of the process is done in a policy-based, rule-based manner. And then, so starting from these, we kind of went to narrow these down into technical requirements. And then these technical requirements are kind of mapped to those high-level requirements. So there is a number of statements as to, for instance, the trust attributes should be, like the authorization server should be able to record trust attributes based on a decision that's made at the time of trust handshake. And then these requirements are mapped with these high-level requirements that I just described and are discussed in the previous section. So that takes us here, and there is a number of areas that's been covered. So these are the ones that are in the first column on the left-hand side. And then on each of these categories, we have identified a number of requirements. I think after this, there is a whole section is dedicated to discussing these further and bringing up examples and justifications as to why or how they matter and are important. And finally, we identified a number of solutions that are out there, be it the OAuth specifications themselves or some other solutions that are provided by other people elsewhere in the community. And there is a mapping in Table 2 where each of these requirements are mapped. Basically, each of these solutions are mapped as to how they cover or whether they cover these requirements. So, for instance, there is like the XML profile that covers certain attributes, and that's been kind of mapped here. That the requirement to distinguish between if they're time-first clients is something that is addressed in these specifications, and these solutions have provided some sort of a solution to that particular requirement. And then there is a distinction between whether a specification or a solution has addressed a requirement kind of in passing, or whether it's been one of the major focuses of that solution or specification. And that kind of led to Table 2. So what I think would be a great way to move forward, it was brought to my attention at the HL7 meetings that there's some ongoing work that could be used to update this. There's like some of these requirements that we kind of identified here, and we assume that they're not covered. There are solutions there are emerging specifications that are addressing them. So those are the areas that I think would be great to have feedback if we want to update this document and kind of continue working on it as a live document. And yeah, so I think with that I will leave the floor open for questions, and if there's anything I can address, I will be happy to explain.
So I guess on this last table, I'm kind of curious. Many, some of the specifications that are available. One, I don't see as columns, but two, the ones that are there, are they actually intending to cover all of the squares? For example, dynamic client registration is really a specification purely for addressing dynamic client registration, and not necessarily having an impact on some of the other trust requirements. So how did you represent that?
Right. So I think this was not an intention to evaluate existing solutions as to whether they're complete enough. It was kind of the other way around. It was an effort to see if there are any existing solutions for each of these requirements and identify the gaps there. So, for instance, if there was a requirement that is not covered by any of the existing solutions, as there are some rows here that are empty, then that would give us an insight into where the current specifications fall short, and we need to focus on finding a solution for that particular requirement. I think.
Can they be combined, though? I mean, are there ones that could work together and cover?
Right, and
or actually the contrary, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yes, these two together cover everything, but they do not work together. That's also possible.
Right. Right. And I think like there are OAuth solutions out there that comply with the core OAuth specification to some extent, but not to the dynamic client registration, and they use some sort of a proprietary way of handling that. I think the core rationale behind this effort was to kind of try to have a more comprehensive picture of where we're at in addressing these trust requirements in the OAuth ecosystem. And so that's the intention. And, if there are shortcomings and there are things that we've missed, as we definitely might have, those were the things that we would be happy to cover in the future iterations.
And I guess the other question I have is, so there are some rows that don't have any gray in them. Is that an indication that this analysis kind of indicates that there's an opportunity to fulfill that?
Right. Yes. One thing, for instance, that I've been particularly keen on is that there is not a standard way to get records, some sort of a audit record from an authorization server, an OAuth server. There's no API defined to query an OAuth server and ask for the record of a client's trust handshakes and failed attempts or successful attempts to that record. And that's something that when like in a specific use case with FHIR, when we wanted to leverage some of that information to actually turn those into FHIR audit events, that's where we had to sort of go and do something that was not really standardized, and it was custom. So there is definitely some of these rows that are not addressed, and there's some of these rows that are sort of addressed by ongoing effort by other groups. I had some conversations with the group that is working on UDAP, is that, yeah, the Unified Data Access Profiles. And they showed me some of the work that they've been doing, they have covered some of the things that are considered gaps in this version of the document.
Yeah, and I think to your point on audit, that's one thing that the pure OAuth environment is probably not likely to fill in, because they probably see it as as proprietary information. Certainly, we could define a implementation guide that binds OAuth requirements with an audit event, but that's not really then going to be leveraging an off-the-shelf OAuth solution. It's a custom healthcare solution, which I think kind of gets me to the next question. Of these rows, and just to pick on this particular thing that's being displayed, what's the specific ones which are healthcare, are special to healthcare, versus these are just mother and apple pie when it comes to REST security or even just generic security?
I think considering where we come from as a group, I would highly suspect that everything that's cited here has come from our bias of looking only at healthcare use cases. Yeah, I think I would say that all of these things have come through a healthcare use case lens, but we can further narrow that down if that's a concern.
Well, yeah, and I guess let me coach a little bit here, because I think we certainly have a different perspective on the priority of them than general IT would have, right? But I think that's just a prioritization difference than a functional difference. So if the functionality is the same, everyone agrees, for example, the AS should be able to process manual credentials and issue an electronic assertion based on their content. That's not anything particularly healthcare special. Yes, we in healthcare may have a reason to put that higher or even lower on a priority than others, and I can certainly see us having a vector through this list which represents that. Hey, we think that the general IT space has this kind of a priority, high, medium, low, but healthcare, because of the fact it's healthcare and the fact that the patient is involved, blah, 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 whatever, we think that the priorities shift for healthcare in this particular way. I think that would be kind of an interesting exercise to see. First question, is it really a generic requirement that healthcare might have a higher or lower opinion of, or is it a requirement that is unique to healthcare, and the general IT space really has no interest in it versus has a very low interest in it, right? I mean, there's a difference right there. There could be a general purpose requirement that in general IT space is just so low as to not rise to them even enumerating it, whereas for us, for example, I think your audit example may fall into one of these cases where general IT would rank it low, because they just simply know that the authorization server is within their organization, and therefore they can inspect the proprietary logs just like they're inspecting all other proprietary logs. But healthcare, we would prefer that the logs get standardized. So I would be interested in that kind of an exercise now that you have this list, without really examining the list and saying, is the list good? Let's just assume the list is good, and is there kind of a feel for which of these are higher or lower?
Right, and I think the proposal that was actually presented to the FHIR community that is also cited here, maybe that would be a good kind of criteria or measure to see which one of these actually were more in line with what FHIR community considered as a concern with respect to dynamic client registration. So there was a number of these that are, so that proposal actually does not provide a solution. It actually lays out what needs to be done. And
so what proposal?
It's the last column to the right. It's a proposal that was distributed in a FHIR Security Zulip. And I don't know if Julie is on the call, but maybe
yes, I am here.
Yeah. So some of the problems that were raised in that draft were things that seems to have come organically from the FHIR community as requirements. And they're covered here not as a solution, but as an area that was addressed in that document.
Yeah, so those, I think we now, well, we approved last week an update to the FHIR spec to provide a pointer to those. So those, I mean, I'd be better if you'd refer to them by name than by just a proposal, you know, to the FHIR community.
I mean, at the time that I was finalizing this, it was a Google Doc that was just cited as such. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just letting you know that last week we did approve to update the security page on the FHIR to point at that set of them, not just the one.
And John, I think Mohammed and I, go ahead, please finish.
Oh, I really don't know if I just wanted to make sure everybody was aware that is going to happen. The current build doesn't have it because I'm stalled behind a different truck right now. But you know, I think we can start to expose some of those things and leverage the fact that they have been published, not that they're anointed or anything, but they've been published and are pointed to. So,
right. I think, Mohammed, are you referring to the fact that the scaling dynamic client registration document kind of falls short on saying this is a solution that should be used, in which case John's assertion that the HL7 FHIR security page will be also referencing these solutions kind of
No, I was just referring to the fact that I have cited that document, and because the conversation was about which one of these are more important to the FHIR community, and I was trying to say probably the ones that were also raised in that document, because that document came out of the FHIR community. Does that make any sense?
Yeah. I think we're good.
I think so.
I'm offering a way to point at something as opposed to just a generic term. So I just did poke into the chat box the text that we approved last week. So the udap.org will have a sentence with the list of things that are there. So I think that's a net positive. I think, Mohammed, from your paper's perspective, and I think the evolution of the paper, I think is what we're talking about, we can now start to pull these in to the fold, along with other things that are listed on the security pages. I noticed you didn't include a couple of other standards that are pointed to from our FHIR security page. So I think this is a good opportunity to bring some collaboration. Is that kind of the intent?
Absolutely, yeah.
But also, John, I think we could add, a document. We have a document library for security, so maybe I should just put one in for FHIR security documents and just start accumulating and have a place that is available to use in other links. So when Mohammed's ready to finalize it, is that okay with you, John?
Sure. Yeah, okay. I guess there's certainly no reason why we can't catalog this if it's published and even point to it via its published identifier. So one thought is, there's no reason why we can't add this yet to the security page.
Right.
I was kind of more playing off of the tease that Mohammed was giving, which is, ways to improve upon some of these evaluations now that we have a start. So I think if we were to catalog it, we could then say, okay, what part of this do we want to have community improvement of? Maybe we can move that portion, like maybe it's this crosswalk here, I don't know, but we could move a portion of this into a collaborative Confluence page where we can have community participation to further improve it.
Okay, so it sounds like we need a FHIR Security projects page and a FHIR Security library or something like that, and then under that we could have one for this particular project, and other things like the work that Julie and Louis are doing.
Well, that's already available.
Right, but
it hasn't been incorporated into this document. It's the first major shortcoming that I noticed when I went to the Connectathon and had conversations there with Julie.
Right,
that was something that was missing.
Sorry. John, did you post it on the FHIR on Confluence?
Did I post what?
The work, that dynamic registration work.
So we approved to make the change to the FHIR specification.
Right.
That's what I put in the comment bubble. We approved that last week. Louis was on.
So I'm just suggesting we also put it in Confluence so people can find it, just in general. If that's okay with Julie, is that okay with you?
I think so, although I'm not sure what you mean by that, Kathleen. What would you like to put in Confluence?
Okay, under the FHIR Security, under Security, we have projects, and we also have documents. And I'm suggesting to start a sub-project for FHIR Security in general, and then for each topic, have a page where people can post papers that they're working on or want people to give feedback on, or just a place where people could find it easily by just searching. Rather, in addition to having it in the actual ballot where you're going to get feedback, through the ballot process.
I have no issue with that whatsoever. I think what you're getting at is just allowing for any conversation to be visible and evidence of editing and maturity. Is this kind of what you're getting at?
Yes, and also just topics come up like you're building an agenda, and maybe there's something about your work, and I have a convenient link I could just put in the agenda. So it's just to facilitate the conversation.
Okay,
also,
great.
Mohammed, at some point, Mohammed's been doing work on bulk data transfer privacy requirements, and I don't know if it's ready for prime time, but that might be one we want to get on the agenda soon.
Thanks.
And just so as not to duplicate things, Kathleen, a lot of what we have been doing already is just on Connectathon track pages, but so as not for those to be kind of in isolation, I imagine we could also post presentations in the field relating to this topic, or to whatever you think is appropriate.
Right. I mean, so it's an ongoing, you're working on this over a course of several Connectathons, then you can add that to that page. I'll send you a link once they set it up, and you can do what you like with it. I have a page that's security-related hymns and Connectathon tracks. And, of course, it's going to duplicate to a certain extent something that's over in the track pages, but it's people want to see the history of what we've been doing on a particular topic, they can go to one place.
So yeah, so I think maybe I'm ready to give control back. It seems like the silence is indicative that we're done with this one.
Yeah, I think I'm not sure what the cataloging, as Kathleen is mentioning. I'm not sure we've identified what portion of your work we want to start working on collaboratively. I think we've thrown around a bunch of ideas, but I'm not sure that we've landed on anything. And maybe that's a discussion that might take a couple of weeks to figure out.
I think probably usually the best way to go at these things is to assign somebody to put a draft out and then collaboratively iterate on that.
Okay.
So, like, I'm thinking we might be able to put like this initial list of requirements out there, and then get the community to refine it and do the next rounds of iteration of that, if that's what we intend to do.
I think that sounds reasonable. So that would be kind of a Confluence page parallel to our, our provenance page and our FHIR GDPR page, where we could start with a pointer to your paper so that we don't have to reproduce the whole paper, and then indicate that we're further improving this via committee or collaboration, and then drop in whatever you think is the most likely first step there. Not duplicating the paper. I don't know that that's useful, because the paper probably stands on its own at least until some major problem is found, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think it makes perfect sense, too. I'm just going to start one under the workgroup projects called FHIR Security Projects, and then a sub for whatever the title, OAuth Trusted, whatever the name. What name do you want to call it, Mohammed? For this collaborative work?
Yeah, I think we can call it the trust requirements for OAuth or something like that.
Okay, that's fine.
Like, I'm not very specific, and I'm sure that other people have better ideas.
We can always change it. I'm just going to get one started right now.
Okay.